And hello again, boys and girls. Welcome back to the channel. It's of course your host Marley Startled, and while we still wait for more patches for Victoria 3, I thought I'd return to it to play one nation I haven't really played yet, which is still a big one, and that is of course Greater Qing. I played pretty much all my nations as my after action reviews now for Victoria, all the big ones, all the big majors, so I thought why not give China a go. I'm still waiting for Paradox to fix the multiplayer and potentially make it easier to actually join matches as opposed to what it has right now, and I'm still waiting for more content because it needs more content. It needs more complex mechanics, a financial system potentially, more resource balances, things like that. But as it stands, this is not enough. I mean, after you play every nation, there's not really any reason to go back to it. And until that multiplayer is fixed, I'm just waiting and waiting and waiting. So we thought we'd go a little after action. This is using Bede's AI revision mod. So of course the AI is on steroids and actually produces stuff. If you want to take a look at what it actually produces, take a look at this bad boy. So it produces 34k from logging camps. So this means, of course, it's a bit easier to actually get money from external markets, but it also means there's a greater demand. Now, what China is great at is it has pretty much every resource it would ever really need. It's got livestock, rice farms, wheat, it's got cotton, it's got dye, it's got opium, which you can't use if you ignore the opium crisis, silk plantations, tea. It's got all the resources you would ever want, with the exception being it does run out of logging camps after a while. But guess what? You've got Russia nearby, and Russia can of course provide you all that sweet logging camps. And it's got pretty much everything you would need in terms of natural resources, apart from one thing, which is of course rubber. But guess what? You've got all of this to sort of mosey in on if you so choose. You can see here I'm still a secondary power because there's no real point of me being a major because I don't need to trade with anyone, simply because I'll just have those majors trade with me. I don't really need to find other resources because I'm just so well equipped. China's great sort of strength is its massive population, meaning that you can really just go full sweatshop mode and resort to basic production on most of your goods early on, meaning that you can just have like a load of workshops just producing tools at the lowest cost option, which of course is crude tools. That means you can of course have lots and lots of tools very early on with a very low cost. And that means that you never really have to worry about immigration or getting to the point where you're going to have issues with immigration or not having enough troops, because every single day your manpower goes up by at least 1 million, and at this stage you can see my pop is now going up by 3 million each turn. In terms of power, military power and tech-wise, it is very difficult to tech up because your early on governments are very anti sort of policies that can change to change the education system. So that means you will initially be on the back foot in terms of population, in terms of literacy and competencies or qualifications, but you can fix that pretty early on via the use of universities in the short term. And eventually, as your population demographics change, as you move to more middle class and industrialized, then of course eventually you'll be able to change the policies and the laws. The big problem with Greater Qing is in fact its population in itself. The big problem is that although you've got such a massive population, the demands of that population are going to be exceedingly massive as well, and so you'll be in a constant race to sort of meet the demands of your population to keep turmoil low. At the same time, as your demographic changes, their needs will change, and if you don't keep an eye on what needs the population wants, you can quickly spiral out of control. So if you do not transition from a peasant economy and start producing consumable goods for the middle classes, your peasants will eventually become wealthier, move to the middle classes, and then this sort of thing will happen. You start getting a rise in the reduced rise in radicals. Not only this, but because you have the land of plenty for a large period of time, it means that if you do have a sudden change, I'll have to wait for this to tick over. If you do have a sudden change of living standards, your radicals will rapidly rocket up in China and eventually run the risk of the Heavenly Kingdom and of course the civil wars and fanaticism and the collapse of your country. This means Greater Qing is a nation of stability. If you're going to do taxes, make sure your taxes stay at a certain rate and you do not change them. If you've got government wages and military wages, make sure you have a certain level and you never change it, because there's no point having a good time in a short time as Greater Qing, because if the financial markets change across the world and you've got to suddenly increase your taxation, what will happen is then you will eventually end up with millions and millions and millions of the middle class or working class kicking off because they've got to pay more money. But on the other hand, it has initially a very basic financial system of, I think it's land-based taxation, which you can eventually change. And because you've got such high authority, you can make tons of money from taxing grain early on. So you can see I can almost make $1 million from grain. Greater Qing is not under threat from its internal markets. It has enough money to industrialize at leisure. The only problem you will have is maintaining the quality of life and making sure it does not fluctuate. You see the moments where it fluctuates, other moments where I have massive instability. You've got to keep it going up or keep it stable. If you do not have a quality of life that is stable, you're going to end up with massive. In fact, you could even argue that GDP after a certain stage isn't even important for China, because what will happen is your GDP may go up, but it's irrelevant to the stability of China, because you just need to make the quality of life stay the same or improve and maintain that improvement. It also means that, of course, Greater Qing has everything and has such a massive population. You do become the key exporter for pretty much everything you'd ever want. So you can see here, because I had a war with the Heavenly Kingdom, I'm still infamous, so I don't think my trade will be as big with the other nations. But you can very early on just export everything. You can see I'm making 300k in terms of grain, and of course people are buying 44k of which from across the world. So if we just take a look at grain, we can see we've got pretty much a large contingent of the world exporting these goods. And of course, because you can pretty much build everything, whether it be luxury goods such as tea or industrials such as tools, there will always be a market and you'll always have enough population to do so. Greater Qing is a great nation in that regard, meaning that its only weakness is if it is interfered with by other major powers. You can see here it's got the issue of fragile unity. If you lose the Opium Wars early on, which is quite difficult to do if you just mass mobilize because you can pay for your peasant troops to hold the line and get a peace deal. If you end up with, of course, the Heavenly Kingdom surviving, the Boxer Rebellion occurring, going into debt or having a civil war, then of course what can eventually happen is your nation will begin to crumble. This means, of course, that in multiplayer games, China left unmolested will become the world power in terms of financial trade, in terms of economy, and eventually towards the 1900s will eventually be able to tech up to military to become an almost unbeatable blob. You can see here 2.5 billion, it just goes up, green line goes up. So it will mean that a large proportion of the time it will be major powers trying to knock Greater Qing down a peg, either by interfering with the Heavenly Kingdom, winning wars for the opium as the British, invading as the Russians. Just all these little things that will hopefully increase or reduce the stability of the nation, leading to revolts. If China is left pretty much to its own devices and pretty much is unmolested, it will effectively just break the game, because it has everything, it has a massive manpower, and the only thing's holding it back is its early game tech, and that's really it. Once it techs up, it becomes pretty much unbeatable. And so if there was a multiplayer game, Greater Qing is your target to knock down. And even if that means depriving it of trade by embargoing it, then of course you can also try and do that. But in truth, you really want to aim to shatter China, because if you do not shatter China, even if you do have trade ports and sort of biased trade systems, you will still be making China wealthy by just exporting goods to other nations. So the aim really for other nations is to knock China into pieces by causing these things and making sure civil war has a high likelihood of civil war and so on and so forth. Now, the bigger limiting factor as China is, of course, that, or the Greater Qing, is the fact that it will struggle significantly with infrastructure. But because it's got such a massive population, there's normally someone with qualifications to run the rail system. So early on, you do want to be researching down a large significant portion of your time into industry. That's of course to get more grain, to reduce the cost of grain, to make sure the peasants are happy, and of course eventually going down down here to get more iron and more coal and so on and so forth, and eventually of course going for railways as well, so your infrastructure remains high. So of course you have full market access and everyone is happy. This means that early on as China, you will be having to sacrifice your research into military or sacrificing your research into society. And that means that it's very vulnerable early on if you want to turn China into a Super Bowl, if it's not against the AI. Very vulnerable to imposing foreign powers, because either you focus on your economy to keep your people happy, or you focus on your military to stay competent against foreign powers at the expense of your society. And the population is your ticking time bomb as China. You need to ensure that the quality of life stays high, and you've got to ensure that you are controlling the unemployment by constant production. And of course, if you want constant production, you need greater access to resources. And after a certain stage, you are going to run out of logging sources of logs, of logging camps. You're going to run out of coal mines eventually, and you're going to run out of iron mines, meaning that at a certain stage you will reach critical mass and you will have no more resources, and you will have to rely on tech to extract it. Of course, that means you'll have to rely on foreign trade from places such as Russia or Great Britain, but again, all they have to do is say no, and then of course you are in a world of hurt, because your growth will begin to stagnate, and if no one is buying your goods, either just through embargoes, you run the risk of course revolution and rebellion. And that's what makes China quite an interesting nation, is the fact that it is a time bomb of population, but also because it's so successful, it can become a victim of its own success, and it eventually will become dependent on the rest of the world in exporting its goods. So if you can see, I'm at 2.5 billion, but all they have to really do is embargo my access to iron or my access to wood, and I run the risk of a complete recession/depression that will lead me to civil war. But the catch-22 of this is that these other nations become dependent on China, or can become dependent on China in the mid to long term, for a lot of the cheaper goods, such as the tools and the steel, or even just other resources such as luxury goods and coal. So this means that although other nations have the chance to cut you off or screw you up in the long term, the longer that that relationship goes on between you and other nations, the least likely they are to sort of cut you off. Because if they cut you off, then their economies will also struggle, making them sort of interdependent economies. See our GDP. We had a war with Russia, I believe here. No, 1888. Yeah, we had a war with Russia because of the Heavenly Kingdom, and you can see their GDP went down a bit and stagnated and then rose once we peaced out. You see here with the GDP of Austria as well, their GDP plummeted because of a war and then slowly going up as well. So other nations, although you may not see it, they may be relying upon you. This has sort of shown me how powerful China has, and why many nations should be early on trying to break up or move into China, because with those trade ports, either as Austria or Britain or France or Russia, or this extra territory from these regions, a massive inflow of population and a massive inflow of those luxury goods makes you extremely more profitable. So North Africa and colonization of Africa is not only just the main thing, it's also trying to get a hold in China. If you can get access to that market in China, you can do very well. Another point to note is that early on as China, you may want to be doing trade agreements with other powers such as Great Britain and Russia, because although you won't get the money from the tariffs, you will need the early resources of these nations to build up your own nation, and you don't want to pay tariffs on it. At the same time, because you've got a tariff-free trade agreement with Russia, Russia will be buying your goods, making the value of your goods more expensive, but at the same time increasing the quality of life and the wages and an extension of taxation of the people in your country. And so actually trade agreements without tariffs can be very useful with nations such as Russia and France and Great Britain, and really anyone can get to. And it's not until the mid to late game, when you no longer need those resources from those nations, that you can begin to sort of ending trade agreements. In my case, I've never ended my trade agreement with with China, with Russia, because I need its logs, and you can make a really good synergy with Russia in terms of they provide the woods and the logs, and you provide pretty much everything else, and Russia can really capitalize on China's need for wood. As a result, it's an interesting nation. You can see here that after a certain stage, it just blows up, and without external interference, and if you do prevent foreign powers from interfering with you and making it more economically sounder for peaceful cooperation with you, then of course you can end up being very powerful very quickly. As for a European power, I think you should be aiming to break up China, because towards the late game, if China has been teching well, and again, I think if it's a multiplayer game, if they ever fix the multiplayer, China will become the big bad and completely destroy everything around it, because of its ability to field so many troops and its capacity to build anything, and the dependence on China in terms of its in terms of its resources. So I think China, for European powers, China should be a target to slowly whittle down and collapse and shatter whenever you can, because you'll be able to, you'll eventually you'll come across a weaker, fragmented nation you can exploit, as opposed to something like this, which is simply unbeatable. As you can see here, finances, I've actually ended up having to reduce my taxation because I just didn't need the money. There is no real issues financially speaking in terms of goods. I pretty much I'm no longer using my maximum amount needed for my build order. In fact, I don't even think that's my maximum amount. Oh, it is my maximum amount. And in terms of actual resources, domestic goods, apart from woods, which of course I have to buy from Russia, there's not a lot there to stop. Yeah, everything's disgustingly cheap. That's really all it is. Everything is disgustingly cheap. I can just export this around the world now if people want it. And the plebs are pretty happy. And of course that means they end up becoming middle class and start wanting all of this stuff, which in itself becomes a nightmare, because then they become unhappy. As you see here, they're becoming more and more unhappy because the standard of living is going up. Bearing in mind, these guys are paying 20% less than the base price, and these guys are paying 15% of the base price, and these guys are paying minus 10% of the base price. They're still painfully unhappy, and the reason why is because even a slight change in that standard of living, this causes them to get pissed off. And so you're constantly having to increase that luxury market now because of that change in demographic, and there's not a lot you can really do about it. But it's really a nation of being a victim of its own success, of really trying to first, once you do defend against the foreign powers, trying to massively industrialize, succeeding, and then having to change your economy to meet the demands, the ever-rising demands of your population. And it only gets worse and worse and snowballs until the late game, because, to put it bluntly, the more successful you are, the greater the population China becomes, and the greater the population China becomes, the greater demand on your resources. And the greater demand on your resources will get to a point where you can no longer really build any more basic resources, because you've already mined everything, you've already exploited everything. The only thing you can do from at that point is either trade or invade foreign powers, which of course you can do if you decide to choose. But really, where are you going to invade? I mean, yes, you've got some sort of elastic, I believe, over here. You've got some sugar, I suppose, if you wanted that. You've got some wood in the south if you want to try and get some wood from these guys. But you just need, you would probably start moving south as China. I think you would probably start moving south. I would conquer this state here. We actually try and conquer it. We'll try and invade all of this, and of course everyone will move to try and stop us. And because we've had the Heavenly Kingdom, it's going to be a bit of a nightmare. But you can just continue to grow, and it's a wonderfully potent, powerful nation, and a great nation. It's great to see what China can become if multiplayer is ever fixed, which is unlikely with the way performance is right now. It is simply a financial juggernaut even at the start of the game, and its only issues is its tech and its population, and that can be quickly fixed. And of course it's military, and population, but military comes under sort of tech. I personally went with sacrificing the military in the early game and this resulting to hordes to hold the line until people got fed up and white pieced. Probably won't work in multiplayer games, but I went with horde blobs blocking the line, and then after that, hoping that it became too financially expensive for foreign powers to wage, and then they'd peace out. And then of course, once they leave you alone, you can then of course do other things and build up, but your biggest issue early on will of course be the Opium Wars. But after the Opium Wars, whether or not you peace out or not, whether or not you get a peace or a draw, you will pretty much be free to go until the Heavenly Kingdom kicks off or Russia wants to do anything. But again, Russia, I would recommend if you were playing as Russia to begin to move into China, just to take this territory early on, and to actually begin to get treaty ports and just try and break up China where you can. Because if you can break up China, you can then of course reduce the end threat that is China, and China will be an end threat without breaking it up. It will be an end threat to effectively everyone, and there'll be nothing you can do to stop it. It will just become an unbeatable machine, and you will all lose horribly. So China is of course a great threat. So let's take a look at our politics overview. You can see here we got industrialists and scholar officials. I've learnt now just to let don't change laws, let them be changed organically for you. So I don't really try and change laws early. If I'm a peasant feudal nation, I don't purposely go for laissez-faire immediately. I let I build up my nation, and then as my nation demographically changes from what I'm investing in, then I begin to pass laws. Initially, you have a massively high level of scholar officials, and then of course as time goes on and people become more industrialized, they immediately switch to becoming industrialists or to move elsewhere. And then of course you can change laws as you see fit, as opposed to just immediately changing laws straight away because it's the most optimum to do early on. It's probably not, because you'll be dealing with constant unrest and dealing with rebellions, whereas this is the more safer way of doing it. And as you can see, the population is massively rural because of the grain, massively literate because of the academia, and you've got a few of the old hangers-on because of the laws. I had to go in the end with religious schools because it's actually very difficult to change religion from change the things such as the state religion, and it's actually very difficult to change the laws and policies away from on that left-hand side. And so you've just got to get your win your battles where you can. So of course I went for laissez-faire, protectionism, because I wanted to increase our trade with foreign powers, but not to the point where it was free trade. And of course per capita taxation. There was no need for colonialization because I don't need any external resources, and there's no real need to change any of this, with the exception of course with propertied women if you need to increase the workforce, and potentially and of course abolishing serfdom, but that happens very quickly in the early game, abolishing serfdom, just by simply building up your economy, and that happens effectively organically. Of course, this starts with no migration controls, and this starts with slavery banned. So after, really, it's just pushing for getting rid of serfdom, and then of course going down these two policies and this policy here when possible. When of course you've got the support to do so, and it's not going to cause any instability. The only reason I'm enacting poor laws is because I want to see if I can financially afford to do so. And again, as you can see, money from tariffs is exceptional, because everyone is buying everything from me. It's insanity. Everything is made in China. Everything's made in China. And of course, if we look at our production, we started building food industries for the liqueur, really. That's really the only reason why I just wanted to build food factories for the liqueur. As I noted, you do have to end up going down the later levels of your industries, because your population is so high that basic textile mills are simply not going to cut it. And so you will have to do heavy investment and research into tech, especially early on, and try and make that a priority. Because if you don't, what will happen is your demand will outstrip supply, and then people's quality of life reduces, and then they all kick off and everything goes horribly badly wrong. And of course, you can see that's pretty much the same effect for everything. You can build everything, but early on, because there's no real base of industry, it does take a while to sort of level up, and you should be going for the higher levels as soon as possible to get as much goods out as possible as China. You see here, we've got massive amounts of wheat. This is really just to reduce the price of wheat for the lower classes, because early on in the game, you will have a demand for wheat from the working classes, and it was not until they go to the sort of middle class strata that they begin wanting other things, and so you do on a large wheat basis. At the same time, I also have a massive livestock farm, and the reason for that is because it's cheap fertilizer, which allows me then to, of course, go up the next level for wheat and grain, and that means that I can then, of course, make even more grain. And this means I don't spend as much on chemical plants, and I can focus more on explosives, because explosives you are going to need to really extract everything you can in terms of coal, iron mines, lead mines, sulfur and gold. You really are extracting. As for these, you just mass produce. You can, of course, decide to go into a luxury market trend, but the problem about that sort of route is that your demographics will move to agricultural and become more regressive, and at the same time you will not meet the demands of your domestic population. So this is not an after effect. You sort of do this afterwards, or because the population wants it. You don't really do this. You don't really invest in this. Early on, because it's not necessary. I mean, you could invest in cotton for fibre, but the great thing about, I think livestock are pretty OP because they provide fabric, fertilizer, and meat, which together means that you can get more wheat and, of course, fiber for your textile mills. You can see that we're slowly going down our tech, but you can see it's still backward. It's 1894, and we're still doing skirmish infantry because we rely more on manpower and just throwing troops at the problem and just slowly draining the enemies. Really, you should be aiming for economic dominance as China, because I don't think you'll ever be able to successfully compete with European powers, especially early to mid-game, both industrially and preserving your population, and militarily and not resulting in your population rebelling. And so you focus more on just making the war as unprofitable and tedious for them as possible, and eventually, hopefully by this sort of level, begin to sort of militarize afterwards. And get lucky with a few of the techs. You can see here I'm still going down other techs. I think I'm going down society at the moment. I made modern sewage a priority because I wanted to, of course, increase my infrastructure access, but really I should probably be going down for trench warfare and all that lovely stuff. And then towards the end we make a ton of ports. The only reason why we make a ton of ports is simply to get enough convoys and clippers to increase our port size to export more goods. Ports are great for doing that, and of course if you can go down the tech tree for either naturally or organically going down for floating harbours and so on and so forth to increase your port level, to increase your trade exports. And of course construction, there is literally no issues. You have all the resources you would ever need to become an industrial behemoth. It's just time taken to do so, and being vulnerable to external powers. China is disgustingly powerful. And of course it will eventually lead to situations such as this, where your markets, the only limitation is your wood and everything else. It's not so much as you don't have the ability to make any of this, it's just that you are plate spinning at this stage. You're just spinning plates going, oh I need coal, build more coal, oh I need steel, build more steel, oh I need fertilizer, build more fertilizer. There isn't an issue trying to find the resources to do so. It's just that you build one thing and another thing becomes more required. You build another thing and another thing becomes more required. It just becomes a thing on repeat. But you can see my big limiting factors are of course hardwood and logging, because there's just not enough wood for this country. And then for luxury goods, again, none of this is an issue for you. If you want sugar, you can just push down south, or you can just do fruit instead, but the population generally isn't going to care that much. You will eventually need to build luxury furniture because your quality of life is just becoming so disgustingly high, you have to. And all this sort of stuff you can easily make once you do transition from a peasant workshop economy to a middle class luxury economy. And militarily, again, not really an issue. You can just start mass producing these when you're at war and get this out the door as quickly as possible, because of just how much of an industrial base you have. Of course, the big issue of your diplomacy is that you can't be too aggressive with Greater Qing, because of course you need to keep your infamy low, so people don't have an excuse to attack you. This changes with the Heavenly Kingdom, because Heavenly Kingdom, if you crush that, you become a pariah, and you run the risk of people declaring war on you. But that's part of the game. It's not a lot you can do about it. I'm just going to lower taxation even more. There you go. And of course our technology, we talked about technology earlier, so we pushed down first agriculture, because fertilizer, make grains cheaper, export the grain. Pushed down here to of course get steam donkeys, iron, and of course we did working tools or mechanical tools. Really industry was our main focus, so we could, until we got to rail, and then we could move to other things. So once we get this chunk done, and once we get rail done, we can then move on to sort of this bracket here, and this stuff here. Then you can move on to other things like military or society. Modern sewage is a must because it increases infrastructure per pop, and so it's so important. If you can go down here and rush down here as much as you can, in fact I'm going to rush down here even more for those 6 weeks, because you will struggle with your market access. You can see here, even with constant building of railways, I'm still needing to build more because of that's how big my industrial base is. It's just an unstoppable mess. And of course our cultures, we've got a state religion, we can of course form no nation, and we've got cultural exclusion, which isn't really going to end the world, and we have a lot of different cultures, but none of which are that much of a nuisance, really. I haven't really had too much of an issue with cultural issues as this nation. But of course, it's our population. You can see here that the average standard of living has sort of stayed the same since the start of the save, but it starts at 11 and then it gets higher and higher and higher. You can see the standard of living just keeps going up as the Chinese, and it just keeps going up and up and up and up and up once you get to that sort of terminal velocity, and if no one interrupts you. And of course the population of this is about 418 million. The population of the lower strata in Greater Qing, 418 million apparently. Oh, let's go back. And of course, again, the things they want are silly now. So let's take a look at actually things they want. So this is a good market. So most of the expenditure is going into grain, clothes, services, but porcelain, the peasant classes are now buying 5% in porcelain. So now you've got to start building luxury goods. Even buying luxury goods, 4.5%. So now you've got to actually start building these things because your population now wants them desperately, and they won't stop demanding it and getting more and more unhappy because you didn't build your economy for that. So you do have to transition your economy at some stage. I honestly don't care about the ironclads. I mean, I can buy some if I want, but yeah, there you go, that makes you happy. My navy is not particularly strong, but I don't really need it. And of course, their demands in middle classes, porcelain, 13%. You can tell how successful the nation becomes by the fact they no longer need food, and they're not spending most of their money on food. They're spending it on porcelain, which pretty much says it all really about the country and its current state. So that is a point to note, is that eventually, if you are successful, people will move away from wanting the basic stuff and moving towards the higher end stuff, and you've got to change your economy accordingly, which then becomes a problem because your resources end up getting strapped. So you see here, I'm not making any porcelain, so I've got to start making porcelain. So I've got to go down here and go, oh, porcelain, oh, porcelain. But then I need glass for businesses, and then I've got to start building this up. It just becomes a bit of a plate spinning exercise as China, because you grow to capacity quicker than every other nation, and after that you desperately need to try and expand or try and trade with other nations, because it's how important, that's how much the population demands stuff of you. And of course the upper strata, which is about 12 million people, they also want porcelain and luxury goods, but it's not that bad. It's just not that much of an issue, really. And also, if we take a look at our population, you can see our labour population is now the sort of majority, with a couple of peasants farming away, and of course a few minor pops, but nothing to the point where it's too much of an issue. I'm not going to get a lot of immigration because I don't have cultural, I don't have multiculturalism, but you don't really need to as China, because its base pop increase is enough to always be building, which is insanity, really. Insanity. And of course, our cultures and our population is majority Mahayana, or religion. This problem became because I didn't notice the change in my population's demands and wants and needs, and that sort of screwed me up. What products? What do I need for this? I need glass. I need lead. So if I go to lead resources, lead mines, I'm going to build a load of lead mines. And eventually the population will begin working there. But towards the late game, if you are this successful, you are good at blocking out the enemy, you are simply going to have to destroy everything. Like, literally destroy everything. And you are going to have to start blobbing elsewhere and eating everything. Because if you don't, you're going to implode. You're literally a never eating. You're Ouroboros, the snake that eats itself. China is the snake that eats itself. If it's successful and doesn't get interruptions, it will grow to the point where it can no longer sustain its growth. And the only way you can continue growth is access to more resources. And the only way to access more resources is by pretty much invading every single country on the planet. And with your massive population and the ability to do so, there's nothing really stopping you from doing so. Of course, we look at nations. This is of course with the Anabid mod, so you can see their GDP is significantly higher. The flotillas are pretty high. You could argue, well, why didn't I get myself recognized as a major power? Simply because I didn't need to expand or get declared interests elsewhere. I didn't need the resources that were on offer elsewhere. I've got access to resources if I wanted to move down into Vietnam. And of course, in terms of population, if we just take a look at some of these things, so if we actually take a look at our financial markets, you see we're at 3 billion as China, as opposed to that 1 billion as Austria, 800 from Great Britain, and everything else by Prussia. We of course are not particularly literate, but that's really the difficult thing to do as China trying to get literacy up. But we're getting there, and we're getting to a sizable, acceptable level, especially with our ridiculous level of universities. And our standard of living is 31st in the world, with Austria being the highest, Bremen being the second highest, and Langfang, of course, being the third. But honestly, for a nation as big as China, you're never going to have the best quality of life because you've got so much demand for your goods. But because our population is so good as well, there's simply nothing to beat us. We are completely unbeatable. And no one will fight you because they'll look at your stats, especially the AI, and they'll be like, yeah, I ain't going anywhere near this guy. This guy has got ridiculous levels of strength, and so we're going to leave this guy well enough alone. And then he'll back out. But trade agreements I've found actually are quite good in the long term. I thought trade agreements early on were a bit naff, because of course you don't get money from the tariffs or trade agreements, but actually in terms of increasing the standard of living for your own population, and for actually encouraging growth in your population, it's actually a very powerful tool to have in terms of meeting demand for basic resources, especially early on. So before, I wouldn't have done a trade agreement because I'd be like, yeah, I don't want to do a trade agreement with Russia because I want them to buy my goods. But actually, because I needed their logging camps, it was really mutually beneficial to have that free trade between each power, because then they buy my goods, the standard of living remains high in my country, and then I can continue growing. Now, the big mistake I found when I was playing other nations is I focused more on GDP than I did on stability in terms of standard of living. Really, the standard of living is the basis of your society, and to meet that standard of living, you've got to have that sort of trade between nations. You've got to have those goods coming in And if that means, and you've got to have them having a livable wage, and if that means you've got to do a trade agreement to keep the standard of living high, to keep the people happy, to keep the stability high, and the radicals low, then that's something you just have to do. And actually GDP is the false number to be chasing. You want to be chasing standard of living, and you want to be chasing that via trade agreements and mutual trade of external goods. You really going to war over this? I mean, fine. I mean, fine. You can go to war over this. But you can see my actual military power is about 2,322, and of course their military power is 10,808. So you can probably tell that it will be a game of attrition rather than a game of actual winning most battles. But that is easily fixable with a few army bases. All we just have to do is build some barracks and change our laws to a military law. That shouldn't be too difficult to do either, because right now we are on... we are on national militia. We could probably change that to a professional army if we so chose, and it would be the larger professional army on the earth. Or we could also change our development, so these guys become shrapnel artillery, and of course skirmish infantry, and first aid, and then we just have to sit back and wait. And I think that should change my power. Not enough, really, not enough, but hey ho. That's my big thing. The issue is the military tech as my country. But the way the war works, I can just go defensive, because defensive reigns supreme. I just have to wage financial war on the French. So if we take a look at their GDP now, it's had a little dump because it's no longer trading with me, but nothing too bad. I mean, I could potentially try and even embargo France and see what happens. To see if it actually does any damage to your economy. Yeah, I had a little wobble there. A little wobble. Not enough to be too much of a problem. And that, I think, is because of the ridiculous amount of resources that are in the world right now. Like, so what if China blockades France? They can just trade with the rest of the world. Resources do need to be limited a bit, either to geographical location to cause wars, or it just needs to be limited by a simple amount. So that resources, especially natural resources such as oil, iron, wood, it should be more limited to geographical locations. So you think Russia for the wood, or you think Brazil for the wood, and then everyone else has a much lesser level of wood, and enough to be self-sustainable to an extent, but not enough to encourage growth. And so then you have this sort of relationship between nations. But as it stands, because there's so much early access to resources, you don't really struggle financially. Yeah, their GDP is starting to plateau. What about my GDP? It went down a little bit, but I can afford that sort of dip. What about these guys? I would like to see your population. I would like to see your radicals. Where are your radicals? Radicals! I want to tell me your radicals. That's a shame. Oh, they started a fight, have they? Fine. I don't think I can win this, but I'm going to slow them down until peace deal comes. Oh, now I can win this pretty much. Let's go to my buildings, go hot, trench infantry, hot, siege artillery, hot, siege artillery, hot, trench infantry. And again, the cost is not a problem. Because worst case scenario, I just end up blockading en masse. take a look at cost of war, 4.8 to their 300. And that's what you sort of do as China towards the end. You don't even try and win, you just starve the enemy financially. Because now they're not going to be able to get goods from China, but everyone else will. They're going to sit back and chill for pretty much the foreseeable future. But that's China. I mean, there's not really a lot more to cover. I'm a financial powerhouse. I'm financially pretty sound. If I was to increase taxing all the way, you get 1.46 million. If I was to reduce everything down and pause construction, I'd be at 2.5 million. And of course my economy would suddenly begin to plummet because of the sudden change in the standard of living, and I'd be at risk of revolution, but it wouldn't be that big an issue. So that really was China. Really fun nation, but a nation that is constrained by the fact that it needs to consistently feed its own population and is very fragile from external interference. And if you're a European power, you don't want China to be left alone. You do want to break it down piecemeal. You do want to slowly feed into it, break it up, especially when it's still got a weaker military and weaker army and it has to rely on defensive actions. The early game, you want to limit China's success, because if you don't, it will get to this stage, it will eventually get to a certain level of literacy where it can just continue teching up its military and its tech and its bolt action rifles, and then it will just overwhelm you and you will be done for. How much did this change my 2,300? Not a lot. I probably should change my laws to professional military, because I think I do have the base support for it from the armed forces now. And I don't think it would be too much of an issue to cause too significant problems in my country. But that's something I would do in another playthrough. Still, great nation. It really is the factory of the world, China. But it is a victim of its own success, and also will eventually have to resort to blobbing out if it does reach this sort of late game level. Regardless, if you want to take a look at the ranking, we can see here, there you go. In terms of prestige, I've got a high prestige, but I'm not recognised. I've got a highest GDP, but I'm not recognised. Not the highest standard of living, the highest one is Austria and Prussia and Krakow for some reason. And then my population is, of course, the highest in the world as well. That's it. Thank you guys for watching. And that will be probably it for Vicky 3 until they release some patches and fix that multiplayer. I don't know if they've done it yet, but I've got to check. I've got to check actually. I did mention it on Steam to see if anyone said anything about it. No, they haven't said anything about it. I had hoped they would say something about fixing the multiplayer by now, but I guess not, because they need to fix that to stop the crashes and to stop the desyncs and all that awful stuff. Also, I would like to see some more DLCs. I want to see a financial bank DLC where it has where you've got a financial system so you can make a world bank and that lends out money. Right now, where does the debt come from? Like, who am I borrowing from? Am I borrowing from my own population? That's fine, but that should mean that then I become dependent on those. If I become too dependent on those debtors, then they could start forcing laws to be passed and things like that cause unrest in my country, or something to that effect. Something that effectively means, like, you know, there should be perhaps another politics tree where you've got debtors or as underneath or something like that, and of course they get more powerful as you become more in debt. Alternatively, and then of course they can start pushing through reforms and that with the or potentially push potentially running the risk of reducing the level of credit I have if I don't start following their laws. That could be a good mechanic of potentially a world bank where you could of course lend money to other powers. So if I was the Bank of England, I could lend money to Austria, but of course that means I would have my own debtors influential group in their nation, and then of course I could try and push for laws and policies by threatening to refuse to loan them any more money. At the same time, I couldn't interfere militarily with those nations by if they reneged on their debt. And of course, it'd make more things interesting, like if a financial crisis, so if Austria reneges on their debt, then all the money invested by the Bank of England, of course, goes up in a puff of smoke, and then of course this causes financial issues in the UK and things to that effect. A financial market would be nice. I would like to see a change to the resources. Right now, I think they need to, perhaps a mod will change that, where to make nations more dependent on other nations and leading to greater political plays, they increase the concentration of good resources in certain nations that can act as a powder keg. So Sweden, Norway, Romania, the Ottoman Empire, Spain maybe as well, Brazil. Effectively, the places where there's lots of wood, keep where there's lots of wood and reduce where normally there wasn't a historical massively large wood economy based in those areas. So you've got a reason to intervene in those areas. But as it stands, you can blob up to this level before you even have to think about your resources, and then that of course means that there really isn't a need to be violent at all, because most of the time you never get to this level of growth or this level of population in most nations, so you don't honestly need to have this sort of level. You don't really need to be aggressive for most of the game, unless you're just trying to chase the GDP number. Did I actually cause? Yeah, I'm causing a decline now in this financial markets. That's good. That's good. And that will hopefully increase their instability and will potentially lead to a revolt. We shall see. Let's take a look. A growing number of radicals, an awfully large growing number of radicals. $2.1 million. It won't really tell me, that's a shame. Oh yeah, final thing. Let's take a look at our population growth. Let's go over our not migration, not country attitude, countries. Let's go to population. Oh, you want to piece out now, do you? Oh, you puppeted Burma. Why? Oh, you must have financially run out of money. That's a shame. Oh, maybe I agreed to the peace deal by accident. I can't remember. Anyway, let's take a look at our detailed list of pops. Sure, I'm sure you can find the most popped place. Go to standard living. No. Oh, I know. You press this button here. There we go. So our biggest pop is 31 million in this one province. And most of them appear to be peasants. And our smallest pop is probably all the way over here somewhere. Yeah, 1.9 million, but hey, that's it, boys. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all later. I'll stop rambling now. But China, very OP. See you guys later. Well, very weak early on. Left alone becomes OP. There you go. Have a good one. Goodbye. Adieu.